What's the goal then in critical race theory? Is it to, I don't know. It seems like one thing that Bell points to is defiance, right? That's kind of all that Black people and maybe white allies can do is to just kind of be this continual gadfly almost, but to not actually buy into the dream of racial equality, which is almost like this opiate of the masses. So I guess that was one question I had. Okay, if that's true, if racism is so baked into America that it's permanent and symbiotic, then what do we do? What's the goal then if it's not racial equality?
So I think with someone like Derek Bell, he has his disciples, Crenshaw, Delgado, who are going to be more critical of his approach. Essentially, I would say that you're going to find schools in the same way that you would in any other intellectual tradition. The main thing that I think most critical race theorists will have in common here, though, is the sort of critique of the incrementalism that they may have thought was present in the earlier traditions of King to some extent, and some of the more religiously based racial folks or persons of color. So the biggest thing for Bell, I think, is there's a sense of empowerment he's going to argue that will come from the fight. Okay. Even though it's the sort of Greek ball rolling on top of you and you push it up, there's a power there. Like you'll feel good about it. I personally think, and that's just my argument, that that's a sort of nihilism. But I don't, we're kind of bleeding into maybe some of the weaknesses. But I think just from we could talk about a phenomenology of emotions and so forth. I think people would feel empowered from fighting back. It's kind of like you think of, clearly you've never been beat up, but someone's getting beat up and it's just fighting back gives you a sense of dignity.
Right.
So even if you lose, and in fact, Bell will say, we're probably going to lose. That sense of swinging back is kind of like yours putting your foot down and saying, this is wrong and I'm going to die. So it's sort of martyrdom if we're analogously to, and you can tell this is where you can tell that in the roots of critical race theory as the patrimony of critical race theory, not necessarily their later successors, but W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Martin Luther King Jr., the great Quaker tradition and the abolitionist movements. These folks definitely are seeing Christ in the disenfranchised. And there's a sense of, going back to say John's gospel that we heard last week, we only went to 17 and not 18, but Pilate says, what is truth, right? But there's a sense if you're a Roman living in the ancient world, Jesus loses. But for the early abolitionists, it's this martyrdom is for the life of the world, right? Now, fast forward, kind of with Du Bois, he's looking at it from more of a sociological perspective, right? He's trained under pragmatic traditions like from William James and others. That sort of metaphysics of the movement is kind of falls off a little bit. But I think at the root of that empowerment move is martyrdom. And there's the empowerment of martyrdom. I think obviously it becomes, and you can tell with the questions that people ask about this, it's not as intelligible because it's what does winning look like? It sounds like you want to root yourself in modernism, in the more secular tradition. How is that empowering? So I think that you can hear both schools. I think that the tradition of martyrdom is its most coherent. That's what you're going to see from King, where he's like, I may not get there with you. That whole tradition of he knows he's going to die. Right. But it's rooted in his Christianity versus the later traditions have sort of, maybe not consciously, but they're still holding on to that without the roots.
Yeah.
So I think both of those are present. I think those who are more secularly inclined are going to talk about empowerment. They're going to talk about the fight. They're going to talk about, Black Lives Mattering, sort of going down with the ship is empowering. And then I think those who are more rooted in the intellectual and religious and spiritual traditions of the Black church are going to say it's the Christ. It's to become Christ, right? So I think you'd see both, but I think just in general, that's how most folks would divvy it up.